It is the winter of 48 BC. A Roman army, commanded by Julius Caesar, marches relentlessly toward the forces of the Egyptian Ptolemaic kingdom. Only a few months earlier, Caesar had defeated his greatest rival, Pompey the Great, at the Battle of Pharsalus. Pompey fled across the Mediterranean, seeking safety in Egypt. He believed the Ptolemaic kingdom would remember the years of Roman support and offer him protection. But instead, they murdered him. Caesar was furious. To him, Pompey's murder was nothing less than an act of barbarism. And even worse, Egypt had now become involved in Rome's own civil war. Caesar had arrived in Alexandria with only a few thousand legionaries. He had not come to conquer Egypt. His goal was simply to settle Rome's political affairs. But instead, he found himself trapped in yet another war. After the death of Ptolemy XII, Cleopatra VII and her younger brother, Ptolemy XIII, became joint rulers of Egypt. But a fierce struggle for power soon erupted. Led by Ptolemy's advisors, the political conflict forced Cleopatra into exile. Then Julius Caesar arrived in Alexandria to mediate the dispute. But Ptolemy's advisors rejected Roman intervention. Their refusal sparked what would become known as the Alexandrian War. Outnumbered and surrounded, Caesar was forced to defend the royal quarter through months of brutal urban fighting. His men faced severe shortages of food and fresh water, while Caesar himself narrowly escaped death several times. Then the situation suddenly changed. Mithridates of Pergamon arrived with a relief army and marched into Egypt. Caesar seized the opportunity. He broke out of Alexandria and moved to join his incoming reinforcements. Recognizing the danger, Ptolemy's forces rushed forward to intercept the advancing Romans. And now, the stage was set for the decisive Battle of the Nile. Caesar deployed his legions for battle. But at the same time, he was using them as a distraction. Farther upstream, his Germanic auxiliary cavalry quietly crossed the riverbank, moving far away from the main battlefield and remaining unseen by the enemy. They reached an advantageous position and waited patiently for their general's signal. Ancient sources do not preserve every detail of the army's deployment, but they make it clear that the Egyptian Ptolemaic forces had taken strong defensive positions along the river. At the location where the Romans planned to cross, Egyptian troops formed a defensive perimeter around the shallowest part of the river. Their goal was simple: stop Caesar's army from crossing. Once his men were ready, the Roman legions moved forward toward the crossing. Among Caesar's soldiers were his veteran legionaries, men hardened by years of brutal campaigning in Gaul and throughout the Roman Civil War. They were, without doubt, some of the finest soldiers Caesar had. The Ptolemaic army, meanwhile, was made up of Egyptian infantry, Greek mercenaries, cavalry, and large numbers of light troops.
Push on to the river!
Considering the narrow crossing point, the defenders had enough strength to prevent the Romans from forcing their way across. The Roman legions pushed forward with strong discipline and cohesion. But the enemy had two major advantages. They had greater numbers, and they held the better position. These advantages allowed them to stand firm against Caesar's more experienced soldiers. The Ptolemaic commanders committed even more troops to the fight, pinning the Romans in place. Soon, the battlefield descended into a slow and chaotic struggle. But this was exactly what Caesar wanted. He waited. Then, the moment he saw that the enemy had committed nearly all of its attention and manpower to the fight, Caesar gave the signal. His Germanic cavalry suddenly charged forward. The Ptolemaic troops appeared completely unaware of what was happening. They continued fighting at the front, unaware that danger was rapidly approaching from behind. Then the Germanic horsemen crashed into the rear of the enemy formation. The impact was devastating. Panic spread through the Egyptian ranks. Within moments, the panic turned into a complete rout. Caesar had successfully broken through the blockade. Now his legions marched along the Nile Delta, moving to join the allied army that was approaching from the other direction. When Caesar finally linked up with Mithridates of Pergamon, his entire force was greatly strengthened. But even now, his army was still believed to be considerably smaller than the forces commanded by Ptolemy XIII. The main Ptolemaic army had taken up a powerful defensive position near one of the branches of the Nile. The ground was elevated. Raised embankments and natural obstacles surrounded the area, creating excellent defensive fortifications. Ptolemy's more experienced commanders believed Caesar would launch a direct frontal attack. To prepare for that possibility, They constructed additional barriers designed to slow the Roman advance if the Romans attempted to fight their way uphill. Caesar was now facing a serious problem. His army was outnumbered, and his enemy occupied a far stronger defensive position. Caesar was certainly a brilliant commander. He had already overcome seemingly impossible situations in previous battles, most famously at the Battle of Alesia. But this battlefield demanded something different. It required patience. It required careful planning. And Caesar understood that. Before committing his army to the attack, Caesar and his commanders carefully studied the enemy's fortifications. They searched for any weakness. Eventually, Caesar noticed something important. The section of the enemy defenses closest to the Nile River appeared to be the weakest. This area was defended by fewer soldiers. More importantly, it offered Caesar a possible route around the main defensive position. If successful, he could completely outmaneuver the Ptolemaic troops defending the fortified hilltop. Ptolemy's main army was heavily influenced by the ancient Hellenistic style of warfare. It was one of the strongest armies the Ptolemaic kingdom had fielded in decades. Thousands of Macedonian-style phalanx pikemen stood alongside loyal Egyptian soldiers and experienced Greek mercenaries. Together, they formed a powerful defensive force. The Roman allied troops began climbing the hill in good order. The Ptolemaic commanders were surprised to see the Romans advancing directly toward their position. With the advantage of both numbers and terrain, the battle appeared to favor them. It seemed like a straightforward victory. But they were not facing an ordinary army. The Roman legions concentrated their attack on the hilltop. At the same time, Caesar sent his auxiliary and allied troops toward the smaller Ptolemaic defenses positioned closer to the river. As fighting erupted along the Ptolemaic left flank, the Roman legions in the center suddenly halted their advance. This was part of Caesar's plan. He knew that sending his legions directly against a fortified wall of phalangites without additional support would be nothing less than suicide. The allied Roman troops continued pushing forward. But the Ptolemaic garrison refused to give way. They fought back fiercely and held their defensive position. The battle continued. And slowly, the Ptolemaic troops began to realize they were being outmaneuvered. They started losing ground. Eventually, they chose to withdraw farther up the slope, moving closer to the protection of their main army. The Roman commanders saw their opportunity. As the Ptolemaic left flank began to break, the Roman legionaries were ordered forward. They climbed the steep slope under a relentless storm of enemy missiles. Arrows, stones, javelins. Everything came crashing down on the advancing veterans. Dozens of Roman soldiers fell as they struggled upward.
Push them back!
But the legions kept
Hold
moving.
the line! Do
As
not
the Roman
falter!
soldiers finally closed the distance, the Ptolemaic phalangites lowered their long sarissa pikes. The Roman legionaries responded immediately. They hurled their pila into the enemy ranks. The impact disrupted the formation and created confusion among the phalangites. The once disciplined formation began to lose its cohesion. Still, the Roman legions continued pressing forward. But the combination of strong fortifications and disciplined phalangites managed to hold the Romans back. On the opposite flank, Rome's allied troops launched another attack against the Ptolemaic left. Once again, however, they failed to make any real progress. Their assault was repulsed. The Roman army still had no decisive advantage. The center was stalled. The Allied advance had been stopped. And Caesar's army desperately needed a breakthrough. With few options remaining, the Allied cavalry attempted another maneuver. They launched a flanking attack around the Ptolemaic position. But before the cavalry could strike, they rode directly into a storm of missiles. Ptolemaic skirmishers unleashed their javelins and arrows. The projectiles tore through the advancing cavalry ranks. The charge lost its momentum. The surviving horsemen were forced to retreat in disorder. The attempt to outflank the enemy had failed. And once again, Caesar's army was running out of options. The Roman legions in the center still could not break through the Ptolemaic defenses. Held back by determined resistance, they were slowly pushed backward. The battle was beginning to slip away from Caesar. Then, at the most critical moment, everything changed. The deadlock was finally broken. On the left flank, Rome's allied troops finally forced their way through the enemy line. They broke into the Ptolemaic camp. After regrouping, The Allied troops turned around and launched a fresh assault against the now exposed left flank of the Egyptian army. The Ptolemaic defenses began to collapse. This was the turning point Caesar had been waiting for. Without hesitation, the Allied troops turned inward. Then they struck the Egyptian army from behind. The Ptolemaic soldiers were suddenly trapped. Caesar's legionaries were pressing them from the front, and the Allied forces were attacking from the rear. Caught between two advancing Roman forces, the Egyptian line finally collapsed. The Ptolemaic army dissolved into complete panic. Soldiers fled toward the river, desperately searching for a way to escape. But the narrow bridges and overcrowded boats quickly became deadly traps. Men pushed and trampled one another as they desperately tried to reach safety. Overloaded boats began to capsize beneath the weight of the fleeing soldiers. Thousands were thrown into the Nile. Thousands drowned in the chaos. Among those trying to escape was the young king Ptolemy XIII. According to the ancient sources, the young king boarded an overcrowded vessel. But the boat could not bear the weight of its passengers. It overturned. Ptolemy was dragged beneath the waters of the Nile. He drowned. His body was later recovered. With their king dead and their army destroyed, Egyptian resistance finally collapsed. Caesar had achieved a decisive victory. The Alexandrian War was over. And with his victory, Caesar firmly established Cleopatra VII as the ruler of Egypt. Thank you for watching this. Please subscribe this channel for more.